Good evening to all the participants. I welcome you to this webinar on behalf of Madras Tax Bar. Today, uh, I just want to give a brief introduction of our speaker for this evening, Mr. Sudipto Bhattacharjee. Mr. Sudipto is a partner at Advaita Legal and has more than 15 years of experience. He focuses on indirect taxes and allied commercial contractual issues vis-a-vis manufacturing, oil and gas, alcoholic beverages, e-commerce, EPC, mining, power, and other infrastructure sectors. Mr. Sudipto has been recognized as highly regarded in indirect tax by World Tax, that is the comprehensive guide to world tax leading tax firms for 2020, and has been repeatedly recognized as an indirect tax leader for India by the International Tax Review since June 2017. Since 2017, Mr. Sudipto has authored a treatise on how GST applies vis-a-vis on various types of EPC and construction contract. This was published by Taxman Publication and has received rave reviews. It is already on its 6th edition. He regularly speaks at various prestigious conferences. He has been quoted extensively by and has also been and has also published several articles in leading newspapers and publications. Today, he has consented on a very short notice to take the session for us, that is Madras Tax Bar, for Madras Tax Bar. And I really thank sir for taking out his time today to give a session. Speaking about his firm Advaita Legal, it was formed in the late 2013 as a specialist tax disputes firm and was the winner of the Tax Dispute and Litigation Firm of the Year India Award in International Tax Review Asia Tax Award 2019-20. Advaita Legal has been recognized as a leading law firm in tax and international trade / World Trade Organization by Legal 500, RSG India Report, Chambers and Partners, and India Business Law Journal. So this is a brief introduction of our speaker for today and his firm Advaita Legal. So before Sir starts with his presentation, we will the entire session will go on like this. First, the presentation will be taken by our speaker, and then at the end of this presentation, we will be having the question answer round. You can raise your hands in the app, or you can put in your queries in the chat box. We will take up questions one by one, depending on the availability of time. So thank you once again all for joining us today, and I thank Sudipto sir for this for consenting to take this session for us today. Thank you, sir. I'll be unmuting you now.
Hi, can you hear me, Prithvi?
Yes, sir. You can start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction, and very good evening to all the participants who have logged in. We are going to talk about 8 topics of disputes, legal disputes, which I foresee will arise, will trouble us in the next 12 to 18 months under GST, more so because, as we are all aware, the collections have dipped significantly. I think there has been a dip of about 70% in April that was reported in the media. So in that backdrop, I think one can only expect, and it's reasonably expect, that the department is going to get aggressive in terms of its action, in terms of its enforcement, because where is the fiscal space going to emerge from for all the stimulus that is needed for funding the rebuilding activity post-COVID? So it is useful as lawyers, as tax advisors, to understand the top 8 that I feel would be relevant in the coming days. I think if I could project the slides, I could start with the first topic. Of course, the first topic today has to be on what the Supreme Court has done vis-a-vis the brand equity judgment. So I think if you could have the slide.
Yes, sir. He will just share.
Yeah. So as the slide comes on, Let's understand what happened today. I think most of you would have read the update that Supreme Court has stayed the brand equity judgment. I must caveat the discussion before we start that I have not read the actual order. I'm basing all of this on the Tax Sutra update that was fairly detailed, I felt. Some of the points may change once we see the order. With that caveat, let me begin. Union of India, as we know, filed a special lift petition against the brand equity judgment of Delhi High Court. And these were the 2 or 3 key grounds it took. It contended that the time limit prescribed under Rule 117 for transitional credit is mandatory and it is also reasonable. It highlighted or emphasized on the reasonableness by highlighting that we would need certain limitations for filing return, for effective administration, for certainty, for smooth functioning, etc., etc. It was also argued that reliance on Limitation Act of 1963 was misplaced by Delhi High Court. Limitation Act cannot override limitations prescribed in a special statute, i.e. GCGST Act in this context. And also the fact that SSC's case was not attributable to technical difficulties on common portal. It was an admitted position of fact. So these are points that the revenue has used to assail the brand equity judgment. Supreme Court has issued notice today. So bear in mind that leave for appeal has not yet been granted. It is merely a notice issue stage. However, unfortunately, Supreme Court has stayed the operation of the Delhi High Court order in brand equity. Now, that was, I must say, a little disappointing. I was hoping that the Supreme Court will keep the right alive for SSCs to keep filing. That part of the judgment will remain operational, subject to whatever the final order of the SC would be. That probably would have been a better judgment for SSCs, but of course, who are we to question the wisdom of the Supreme Court? However, I must say that there is one point that probably would have weighed in Supreme Court's mind, because I'm sure you would have noticed that there have been several SLPs that were filed against favorable orders on Tran 1, right? And in most cases, Supreme Court refused to intervene. In limine, all of those challenges were dismissed. So why this one? What was so special about this particular case? Apart from the fact that I think this specific point of 30th June was made, one observation that came towards the end of brand equity case, where they held that, and I'm reading out the excerpt that's there on my slide also, we are also of the opinion that other taxpayers who are similarly situated should also be entitled to avail the benefit of this judgment. Therefore, respondents are directed to publicize this judgment widely, including by of publishing the same on their website, so on and so forth. So here, one can say, one can argue that the Delhi High Court is probably trying to overreach, probably trying to assert powers or pass an order which is akin to Supreme Court's power under Article 141 and 142, but missing for a High Court in 226 and 227, because they are not restricting this, at least they're not spelling it out, to taxpayers in the territorial jurisdiction. Despite the fact that several other high courts have been seized of the Tran 1 issue, they are laying a carte blanche, so to say, for all taxpayers who are similarly situated. Probably this might have weighed on in Supreme Court's mind while staying this. I'm speculating, of course, but this is something that that came to my mind. What are my thoughts? Is it doomsday? Does it mean that SSCs have no further remedy, and we can't take this? And anyone who has missed out has become remediless? I don't think so. I think it's far from that, because, in my humble opinion, with the greatest of respect, the argument that the time limit is mandatory, is not mandatory rather, is very strong. Delhi High Court has spent a lot of time and space in explaining why the time limit under Rule 117 is not mandatory. It is merely directory, because the government itself has made so many exceptions to the time limit. So clearly, and there is a lot of jurisprudence on when a provision can be mandatory versus directory. Delhi High Court has discussed that at length, and it fulfills all the tests of being directory. Further, Delhi High Court is not the only High Court which has held these provisions, the time limit, to be directory. I think all of you are aware of the Punjab High Court order in Adford batch of matters. We were one of the petitioners there, and Supreme Court refused to intervene there. And Punjab High Court has again upheld the same judgment very recently in the case of Amba Industrial, I think a couple of days back, where they have very categorically, they have relied on brand equity, but they have also relied on advert. So even if you take away one pillar, which is the brand equity judgment of for Amba Industrial, advert still remains, and advert has achieved finality because the SLP against advert has been dismissed. So to my mind, SSEs who have missed out on transitioning credit must still log their claim within that 30th June period, keep the claim alive, live to fight another day. Second point that may become relevant for a few players is evaluating the possibility of filing transfer petitions which are pending before various other high courts. So that these cases we can go fight straight before SC, because now that the Supreme Court is seized of the matter, we can file a transfer petition under 139A of the Constitution, and especially in high courts where these issues have been pending for a very long time, or where from previous orders we know which way the High Court is going to decide. So in those kind of cases, and especially where the admitted facts are such that there are no technical glitches, where the SSE have not even claimed a technical glitch, in that sort of a scenario, it may be worth considering if a transfer petition ought to be filed, so that there is a fast tracking of the litigation and a certainty of conclusion can be achieved before the Supreme Court, instead of spending years before the High Court and then going to the Supreme Court on this matter. So I think these are my takeaways for today from the brand equity decision without reading the order today. So let's move on from brand equity to the next issue, which is on COVID-related issues. I think you can move to the next slide. So on COVID-related issues, there are a bunch of aspects under GST that would bear analysis. Let's start with the most popular one, force majeure. I'm not going to get into details on force majeure. I think there is enough gyan on universe in the last 3 months that has been accumulated on force majeure. Hundreds of webinars have been conducted. But just to set the context, I think at a 10,000 feet level, we all understand that force majeure is purely contract driven. Parties define what is force majeure for that particular contract. In majority of COVID-19 cases, force majeure clause will lead to a deferral or suspension of obligations, not a waiver or neither a termination. In most cases, because COVID is about a 3-4 month at max kind of a disruption, it would lead to a deferral suspension of obligations, right? If we now extrapolate this into the GST context, as we are aware of Notification 35 of 2020 issued under Section 168A, which gives an extended timeline for several compliances, but excludes two very important things. One, the whole of Chapter 4, which deals with time of supply and value of supply of goods and services, and Section 31, which pertains to raising of tax invoices. What this means is, for any continuous supply contract, most prevalent example is of course commercial real estate leases, because most large companies would have a lot of office space that they have taken up on rent, on lease from real estate suppliers, from real estate owners. In all of those cases which will qualify as continuous supplies, such clients, such companies may plead force majeure to say that our obligation to pay the lease rental ought to be deferred till the force majeure condition of COVID is over. They may succeed, they may not succeed. If they succeed, what is happening is, while the payment obligation has gotten deferred, the obligation under the GST statute to raise the invoice, deposit GST, they have not gotten deferred adequately. So the real estate, the lessor, in this case, the supplier, the service provider, he is responsible to undertake the compliances of GST, and to that extent go out of pocket without getting recompensed, reimbursed by his client. Now, there are two ways a lessor can deal with this. One, he can argue that force majeure has been invalidly claimed, litigate that, arbitrate that, dispute that, or instead of spending time and energy on a force majeure claim, on a contractual litigation, the parties can come to the table, mutually agree on an addendum or an amendment to say that let us postpone the billing milestone in our contract, the lease invoice milestone in our contract, to maybe by a couple of months, by 1 month, or whatever. Something that mitigates the cash flow impact of the lessor, and thus becomes a win-win proposition for both parties. Of course, what I suggested is merely the path of least resistance. In many cases, the path of least resistance will not be followed. It will lead to a conflict. Force majeure invocation has already led to a few High Court decisions, and I'm sure in the coming days it is predicted that several more litigations will emerge. Many of you would have followed the recent Delhi High Court litigation between Halliburton and Vedanta. Halliburton won the first round, but as of now, Vedanta seems to have had the last laugh. Now, there will be many more such examples. So as GST professionals, what is our key takeaway from this? All disputes will end in two particular outcomes from a GST perspective. Either there will be an award of damages, liquidated or otherwise, by a court or by an arbitral tribunal, or parties will enter into a settlement deed, an out-of-court settlement amongst themselves to close the dispute. Let us examine the GST implications in both cases. Next slide, please. Before this, yeah, thanks. So let's start with liquidated damages. I think let me set this at the outset, unambiguously, unequivocally, that the legal position is very, very clear, that there should be no GST on damages or compensations for breach of contract. I'm completely aware that there are advanced rulings that state against this, several of them in fact. I'll come to them. But let's start with the legal position, the correct legal position. Damages cannot be said to be a consideration for tolerance of a breach. Damages are the consequences of a breach. If you look at a contract, if you look at contract law, section 73, 74, I think it becomes very, very clear that if parties have pre-agreed a particular quantum as liquidated damages in the contract, it does not mean that one party is allowing the other party to breach the contract. There is no agreement to breach. It is if I'm breaching the contract, I'm suffering the consequence, I'm being punished for the breach by way of a pre-agreed amount of compensation. The pre-agreement does not take away the very nature of the payment, which is in the nature of damages. Now, while there are advanced rulings that have come up, if we look at decisions from tribunal, decisions from High Court, there are quite a few decisions which lay down the correct position of law. At this stage, bear in mind that the relevant legal provision which leads to this whole debate, the so-called deeming fiction of service of tolerance, the language is exactly similar in service tax, negative list-based service tax, as well as under GST. So the judgments under service tax will be applicable on all fours on GST. And I'm really sorry to the participants, I just suddenly lost the connectivity.
Yes, sir, you can start now, sir. There seem to be some connectivity issues.
Okay.
It's fine now.
Right. Okay, I'll stop the video so that the network is not overloaded, right? I'll come back on the video after the end of the session. My apologies to everyone. Sorry.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Okay, I'll stop the video. So talking about liquidated damages and the decision of Bombay High Court in the case of Bai Mumbai. Before that, rather, I was talking about the two SESTAT decisions which have come in the context of service tax law. After that has been followed by a Bombay High Court decision in the context of GST, specifically in the case of Bai Mumbai Trust. Here, the issue was not a tax matter. The issue was whether a payment of damages by a defendant to a court receiver. The defendant was in prima facie illegal occupation of the suit premises, and the question was raised that whether GST is liable to be paid on damages. Mr. Sridharan was appointed as the amicus curiae. Detailed arguments were placed on how GST is not liable to be paid on damages, how payment of damages cannot be consideration for a supply. And to that extent, Bombay High Court categorically has held that no GST is payable on damages. This was not a specific case of liquidated damages, admittedly, but I think once the principle vis-a-vis damages is frozen, it is jolly well applicable to liquidated damages also, because whether liquidated or unliquidated, damages remain damages. They cannot be consideration. This point can also be buttressed through another provision from the Contract Act itself. If we talk about tolerance, it is possible to argue that the concept of tolerance is traceable to the concept of remission under Section 63 of the Contract Act itself. Remission talks about how one party, a promisee, a recipient of promise, can agree on a satisfaction in some other form or by extending the timeline. If agreement is being reached under 63 in the form of remission, that probably may qualify as tolerance. But if a payment is being made under 73 or 74 of the Contract Act by invoking liquidated damages clause under the contract or by a court mandated damages, it can never qualify as consideration. So I think we have favorable CESTAT decisions. We have a Bombay High Court decision which can support this kind of a position. So to that extent, as I said in the beginning, the law is very clear, and the position for litigation on this is also very clear, that no GST should apply. Having said that, because there are advanced rulings which have gone against, ultimately it becomes a commercial call. For us lawyers, we are advising clients, we need to tell them that ultimately there is a risk of litigation. So contractually, we need to agree, is there, who bears the risk of this litigation? Who bears the cost of this litigation? If neither parties agree, then one of them has to charge the GST on this liquidated damages also. Or the party which is not charging agrees that, okay, if there is litigation, I will handle it, that's my headache. It is better to agree on that point upfront while dealing with liquidated damages, rather than keeping it for a subsequent negotiation. The legal point I have already clarified, but commercially that needs to be agreed, that risk of litigation, if any, is being borne by whom. That is a prudent drafting practice. Second point, let's come to settlement deed. When we come to settlement deed, however, the position of law is not as equivocal or not as clear as we discussed in the context of damages or liquidated damages. For settlement deeds, a good place to start is an Australian GST ruling of 2001/4. Beautifully articulated, it talks about 3 different types of supplies that can emerge from a settlement deed. One is an earlier supply. So if the settlement deed is only covering a previous supply, meaning thereby, say there is a dispute in a construction contract between 2 parties. One says that 89 needs to be paid, another says no, 95 needs to be paid, and then they settle at 92. So that is for the work already done. 92 is for the work already done, and to that extent, it should attract GST liability. Then comes current supply. Current supply is when a new supply emerges from the settlement deed. And I'll give you an example. Say there is a trademark owned by a company in Chennai for a particular food item. Okay, I use the same brand name, same trademark to sell the same food item in Delhi. The Chennai owner sues me in Delhi, or not sues me, but issues a legal notice. We decided not to fight it. We agree, we enter into a settlement deed saying that, okay, this is the amount that I will pay, and in return, you will give me a license to operate in Delhi by using this particular brand name. That is a current supply. That is a supply that emanates from the settlement deed itself, and that also should be liable to GST. The third category is what is called discontinuance supply. Discontinuance effectively means release from legal claims, which is essentially the subject matter of a settlement deed. So what the Australian law says here is, if the only payment being made under the settlement deed is releasing someone from legal claims, is stopping further litigation, most likely that is a payment of damages, that is a payment of compensation. If there are no other transactions happening in a settlement deed and there is only a release from all legal claims by parties, most likely it is a payment of compensation. If it's a payment of compensation, there cannot be a levy of GST. So a nice analytical framework has been provided by Australian Tax Office in the context of settlement deeds, which we can apply. Of course, in the context of service tax, this has been examined by CESTAT, Kolkata CESTAT, in the case of Amit Metallics, where they did not go into this detailed analysis. They just said that settlement deeds have resulted in creation of a debt in favor of the appellant, and thus this is an actionable claim, and to that extent excluded from the definition of service itself. Now, this is very attractive as a proposition, because without going into all the lengthy analysis in Australia that we saw, straight away we are repelling our taxability, our tax exposure. And the exclusion for actionable claim exists under GST also in a different form. So to that extent, this would be applicable to GST also. However, I believe that whether or not a settlement deed is an actionable claim, I think this is not the last word on this. I believe there will be more litigation on this. So while we are advising clients, it is useful to also use the analytical metrics that I just outlined from Australia, to use that and then do a risk analysis. Of course, the argument in Amit Metallics remains as a defense, remains as a shield. Should we want to litigate? Should we want to fight this out for a particular client? But while we are advising, it is better to also use the analytical metrics used in Australia. Moving on, Aditya, if you can go to the next slide. Let's talk about another aspect arising out of COVID, which is ITC on COVID-related expenses. Let's start with medical insurance. I know a lot has been written on this, but let's quickly run through this in detail. The context of this arises from Section 17(5)(b), which restricts credit vis-a-vis health insurance, with the exception that if it is obligatory for an employer to provide the same to its employees under any law for the time being in force. So let's examine whether what we are talking about, the MHA guidelines, will qualify as any law for the time being in force or not. 15th April, MHA order of 15th April, it had 3 annexures. Annexure 1 contained guidelines to be enforced by district magistrate. Annexure 3 was a compendium of offences. Annexure 2 contained a standard operating procedure for companies, for industries, for establishments to adopt before starting their functioning. And Annexure 3 was referred to in para 21 of the guideline. Point 5 in Annexure 2 talks about medical insurance for the workers to be made mandatory. Interestingly, the MHA guidelines of 1st May, Annexure 2 is missing. Annexure 1, Annexure 3 is there, Annexure 2 is missing for some strange reason. Now, I believe it is still reasonable to conclude that a pre-opening standard operating procedure as per Annexure 2 will continue to apply even post 1st May. There is absolutely no reason. It would be absurd to suggest that if a industry or establishment is reopening after 1st of May, it does not need to follow the SOPs that have been laid down. Further, medical insurance has been mandated. So effectively, medical insurance has been mandated under Section 10(2) of the Disaster Management Act, which makes it obligatory. Because Disaster Management Act, as we know, when it is invoked, it becomes applicable all over India, and to that extent, the obligatory nature is established. However, the MHA guidelines cease to have effect from 18th May 2020, except for some specific aspects, which does not include the medical insurance aspect. So now let's look at certain fact scenarios, certain nuances as to how all of this comes together. Go to the next slide, please. So let's look at the first point. ITC, whether it is eligible for premium that is paid between 15th April and 1st of May. I think this is a fairly safe conclusion to make, that ITC should be eligible. 15th April to 1st May, the guidelines were very clear that premium has to be, that insurance has to be arranged for employees, and to that extent, ITC should be eligible, except in cases where the state-specific orders say otherwise or do not contain a similar guideline. For example, while the Tamil Nadu guidelines of this period specifically contain a reference to medical insurance, the Maharashtra guidelines do not contain any such reference. Now, one can, of course, argue that this being under the disaster management law, the central rule will prevail. And if there is anything missing in the state guidelines, that I mean, we have to read the central one into the state guidelines, but that's a matter of fairly prolonged litigation. While I foresee that the courts will be liberal in granting benefit of credit in these circumstances, but we need to be cognizant. The risk definitely goes up when the state-specific order does not contain a specific guideline for medical insurance. As I said, Tamil Nadu guidelines did contain it, Maharashtra did not. These are the two examples that I had seen. Coming to the second period, which is between 1st May and 15th May, here again, I believe ITC would be eligible, even though Annexure 2, like we discussed earlier, was missing in the central order in the MHA guidelines. But for reasons that I discussed, I think it could continue to be available as long as the premium is paid before restarting office post-lockdown. This is again subject to state orders. Happy to report that TN guidelines for this period also contain a mandate for medical insurance. Where policy was taken prior to 15th April, but a COVID rider was added after 15th April, I think it's commonsensical to conclude that to the extent of the COVID rider of that additional fee, ITC would be available. If a policy was already in place before 15th April, ITC may not be available. If ESI Act covers a particular industry or a segment of workers, Employee State Insurance Act, people who earn less than 21,000, for them it was anyway obligatory under law, and ITC was always available, so there should not be any doubt in a post-COVID scenario. The next part is, of course, vis-a-vis family members. So ITC, if the policies, comprehensive policies are taken at a company level, which covers both family members of employees as well as employees, there is no bifurcation, then of course there can be a pushback from the revenue saying that to the extent it is allocable to the families, such ITC should be denied. And probably rightly so. So it would be prudent to obtain a bifurcation or separate policies. Some companies I know have said that we are trying to get a separate policy for employees and separate for their families. In some cases, it is not possible, but some sort of a workaround or bifurcation, even if at an internal level, if it is there, it will be useful. Otherwise, it will be left to the department to do some sort of a bifurcation, and that will, of course, be litigative. Now, another point or nuance here is vis-a-vis the fact that the words medical insurance and health insurance are used interchangeably. If we look at the MHA guidelines, it talks about medical insurance, GST law talks about health insurance, IRDAI circular talks about health insurance. I believe that common parlance meaning has to be adopted, because none of these laws, MHA or GST law, define these two terms. If we adopt a common parlance meaning, health insurance usually has a wider connotation. It should include medical insurance also. Medical insurance typically connotes hospitalization related expenses, and health insurance would cover some pre-hospitalization, post-hospitalization things also. It may be a prudent best practice to obtain a letter from the insurance company stating that the insurance being obtained is a medical insurance policy in line with the MHA guidelines. That may obviate or preempt any dispute with the GST authorities. Moving on to the next slide. Aditya, could you go to the next slide, please? Yeah. Let's talk about the next aspect of COVID-related expenses, which is in the context of the restriction under credit rules vis-a-vis goods or services are both used for personal consumption, right? Now let's look at some of the instances where that restriction can come into play. If a company is purchasing assets like laptops, internet dongles, etc., for providing to company employees for remote working, I think it's a no-brainer that these expenses should be eligible. These are definitely not for personal consumption, but are in the course of business. They're like a tool to enable employees to perform official duties and tasks from home. Payment or reimbursement of mobile bills, internet bills of employees. Now here there can be two scenarios. If the bill is in the employee's name itself, then it is not received by the company. The service in question is not received by the company, and in that case, it would not be eligible. But if the bill is in the company's name itself, even though the connection address shows employee's residence address, to that extent, it should be eligible because it is definitely in the course of business. Third head is expenses incurred for deep cleaning, fumigation of office premises, or thermal scanning, hand wash. I mean, the entire 9 yards of post-COVID related protections that companies have been forced to adopt. I think they will also qualify as eligible credits, because again, none of these are for personal consumption of an employee, but this is a necessary expense by a company in the course of business for ensuring health and safety of employees. And many of the MHA guidelines, even the last one also talks about these SOPs. Some of the state specific guidelines also talk about these steps to be taken. So all considered, I don't see a doubt, I don't see a problem in eligibility of credit vis-a-vis such expenses. And last but not the least is free transportation to employees for their home office, home commute. Here again, the question or the thing to be seen is it mandated under any of the applicable guidelines, state or MHA? As per the last MHA guidelines, it were mandated. The TN Tamil Nadu guidelines that I saw last were also specific that you can't let your employees be dependent on public transport. You have to provide transport facilities for people coming from outside. And to that extent, wherever these kind of guidelines exist, I think it would be obligatory for an employer to provide, and this would also be eligible as an expense. Moving on, let's go to the next slide, Aditya. So this is a topic I thought let's deal with all the outcomes, all the consequences of a 2A 3B mismatch at one go. And it's kind of shocking when you see that something as basic, as mundane as mismatch between GSTR 1 or 2A or 3B can lead to so many consequences. The first consequence is blockage of ITC under Rule 86A. I know if you look at the rule, it talks about reason to believe fraudulent development of ITC, which sounds like a very serious thing. But practically, we all know for what purposes and in what scenarios such reason to believe has been invoked. 2A 3B mismatch forms a major part of cases where 86A blockage has been invoked. Then 36(4), where availment of 90% of about your unreconciled ITC is being deferred. I know that 36(4) is now being deferred to September, but you still have to comply with it in September cumulatively. And third, and this is the most recent one, where refund of accumulated ITC has been restricted to invoices reflecting only in 2A. Now, some of these points are not very new. Many of you would have dealt with this for your clients. People would have gone to the officers, tried to explain, trying to reconcile and get their ITC unblocked or get credit out of the restriction of 36(4). But in today's times, in the post-COVID time, when in liquidity, when cash flow is at a premium, is of the highest importance, do we have the bandwidth? Can we deal with these things in the same manner as we were dealing with it in November of 2019 or December of 2019? I think not. I think there is a case for dealing with this in a more aggressive manner, in a more determined manner. And all of these provisions are completely vulnerable to a writ petition. And let's deal with them one by one. Let's start with Rule 86A. Now, I think, at least till the Supreme Court overturns that proposition, I think it's now fairly well settled through various High Court decisions that ITC, once it is vested, it is a property of the assessees. It is protected by Article 300A. And you cannot block ITC merely on the basis of 2A versus 3B mismatch. That cannot be your sufficient reason to believe. And especially when you are using 86A, using that as a reason to believe, to block ITC without any hearing, without any due process of law, without following natural justice norms, it is completely vulnerable to a legal challenge. There are clear enforcement provisions under 73 to 76 of the GST Act, where a rationale, where proper safeguards, procedural safeguards have been laid down for assessees. There is a proper procedure for a show cause notice, hearing, order, etc., etc. No such rationale exists, and one can just take away your right to enjoy, your right of access to your property, i.e. your ITC, by a reason to believe. And that reason to believe has been invoked repeatedly in the context of Rule 86A. Someone has mentioned unable to hear. Am I audible? Prithvi, can you hear me?
So yes, sir.
Okay. Okay.
So to all the participants, yes, sir, you can continue.
Okay.
So we can take up the question.
Okay, now,
of the session, sir. We can hear you also.
Sorry,
Sir.
sorry.
So we are able to hear you,
Okay,
sir.
okay, okay. Fair enough. I'll continue. So coming to 36.4. 36.4, I think, as many of you would be aware, has already been challenged in 3 high courts. Unfortunately, because of COVID, no orders have been passed yet, and courts have not really applied their minds on this yet. But the arguments against Rule 36.4 are also very strong. It is completely ultra vires sections 41, 42, 43. 43A of the CGST Act, which envisages something similar, was never notified. So if the Act was never notified, on what basis can all of this on such a severe restriction be brought in by way of a delegated legislation, by way of a rule? Also, Rule 36.4 does not distinguish between bona fide cases where a mismatch is due to any act or omission of the supplier, or malafide cases where there is a bogus or fraudulent credit is sought to be claimed by collusion between supplier and recipient. So that is a clear violation of Article 14, because that's like treating unequals equally. This is a ground that has been relied upon in the context of VAT in the case of Arise Industries by Delhi High Court, which, by the way, has been affirmed by the Supreme Court as well. So Rule 36.4 is vulnerable, as I said, against a writ remedy. It just does not make sense that, because I'm sure many of you are aware that 2A 3B mismatch can happen because of myriad reasons, and not only because a supplier has failed to do something or there is a collusion. We can't treat the entire bundle of reasons under one box and treat them and punish them all equally. That is a straightaway violation of Article 14. So I'm fairly hopeful that 36.4 will meet its end fairly soon. It will get struck down by at least one of the high courts before which is seized of the matter. Third is refund of accumulated ITC being restricted to 2A. This came in as a part of para 5.2 of the circular 135 on 31st March, probably to align it with the Rule 36.4 itself. The funny thing is, in para 2.2 of the same circular, it refers to Delhi High Court judgment in Pitambara books, where it says that circulars cannot withdraw benefits or impose stricter conditions as postulated by the law. So basically, circulars can't override the law, right? Very, very well settled principle. It quotes that principle, and 3 paragraphs down, it just goes to negate that very principle by saying refund of ITC will be available only to the extent invoices reflecting 2A. Now, where is this restriction coming for under Section 54? Where is this restriction coming from anywhere else in the rules? A circular cannot bring in a restriction. I think I don't need precedents to emphasize that point to this particular group of listeners. There's a very, very well settled position of law, and clearly anyone who is getting affected, whose cash flows are affected because of refunds being restricted to 2A, to that extent, this is completely vulnerable to challenge. And this becomes all the more relevant because you have now suspended, not suspended, but deferred the compliance of Rule 36.4 by 4 months. It is now to be cumulatively complied in the month of September. So to that end, there may be very minimal things being reflected in 2A anyway. It does not make sense for this period when cash flow is at such a premium, it's such a critical thing for businesses at this juncture to restrict refund only to invoices coming into 2A. So all of these consequences that arise because of mismatch of 2A versus 3B ought to be dealt with more aggressively, ought to be challenged before a court of law and there are very strong arguments to that effect. And there is one particular reason, one last reason why I recommend a stronger strategy, a stronger reaction. And let's go to the next slide to deal with that. I'll move to the next slide. Next slide, please. This is the last point that I wanted to highlight in the context of 2A 3B mismatch. Now, all of you are aware that in the Budget 2020 and subsequently in Finance Act 2020, fraudulent availment of ITC has been brought in under Section 132C, which is a cognizable and non-bailable offense. So What it means is it has now also come under the ambit of preventive arrests under Section 69(1) of CGST Act. Basically, if a jurisdictional commissioner has reasons to believe that a recipient has fraudulently availed ITC, arrest may be authorized. Now, where have you seen this language before? In Rule 86. In Rule 86, where has reason to believe been held to be applicable by officers? When there is a 2A 3B mismatch. So if it qualifies as reason to believe under Rule 86A, is it too far-fetched to think that this 2A 3B mismatch will also be used as a stick to threaten, to coerce assessees to to pay up just on the basis of 2A 3B mismatch? To my mind, because there can be so many outcomes of a 2A 3B mismatch, it is imperative that a more aggressive stance is taken to deal with all these outcomes. At the very end, I want to highlight, and in full disclosure, this is a writ that we have filed on behalf of a telecom company in Delhi High Court. Even 16(2)(c) of the CGST Act, which mandates that supplier has to deposit the tax, etc. Why should I, as a recipient, be bound by or suffer because of a why should I suffer because of that default of a supplier? It is completely unfair, arbitrary, illegal. There are case laws to this effect from the previous regime. I have no control over what the supplier does. The state government, the state and the central government have empowered themselves with powers of audit, search, seizure, arrest, everything to ensure that SSE is compliant, that the SSE deposits taxes on time. All of those powers are there with the government. So how can a recipient, how can a sovereign duty be outsourced to a recipient and the recipient punished by denial of credit for a supplier's mistake? These are grounds that we have taken in 2 separate petitions before the Delhi High Court. I think these arguments also permeate the arguments to be taken against the other 3 outcomes or other 3 consequences of 2A 3B that we just discussed. Let's move to the next slide. This is again a relatively new thing that has come on 23rd March 2020, where Rule 89(4)(c) has been amended. Rule 89(4)(c) talks about turnover of zero-rated supply of goods. Now that has effectively been benchmarked to domestic supplies to 1.5 times the value of domestic supplies of like goods by similarly placed suppliers. Now this again is completely ultra virus, and this is leading to a lot of heartache. This is leading to a fair bit of reduction, a fair bit of effect on working capital, because the moment you are reducing the export benefit, and these arguments also permeate the of 2A 3B that we just discussed, where Rule 89(4)(6)(a) has effectively been benchmarked by similarly placed suppliers. Now this finds any of your clients who are affected. Some clients may be very minimally affected, so of course they don't need to be bothered with this, but wherever there is a significant impact of this particular rule, I think this is clearly ex facie arbitrary, completely ultra vires Section 54(3), because nowhere does 54(3) prescribe for this kind of a mandate or this kind of a restriction. It's vulnerable to remedy, because let's face it, if it's a genuine export linked, if it's a genuine transaction of export, it is leading to a forex earning for the country. That has also been mandated. It has been mandated to ensure, I mean, the law has been amended, and on the same day, the rules have been amended to ensure that the forex is earned back. So if the forex is being earned back, the forex is being move to the next slide. Transaction, on what basis can expect that has effect on such genuine transaction? And also, even you are reducing the substance also if there is a difference in value. Some clients may be very minimal. Wherever there is a significant completely under Section 54(3), because this kind of a restriction to be linked, if it's a genuine transaction of export sales at a price than domestic sales, that is one of the even the difference in value between export and domestic sales. That is one of the more than doing domestic sales. So it is not a far-fetched thing to believe that it can be more than 1.5 times. So this is pegging export benefit to 1.5 times of domestic supplies, to my mind, is ultra virus. It's disproportionate, extortionate, and to that extent, it will be completely vulnerable to a writ remedy. I foresee a lot of litigation vis-a-vis 89 4C in the coming days. It has only started being implemented, I think, from April onwards, when people have started filing their refund claims. So as it starts hurting people more, I think writs will start getting filed against this. To my knowledge, so far this has not been challenged yet. Let's move on to the next one. Input GST credit for malls, and so this is I would say, a proactive litigation solution. All of you probably have heard of the Safari Retreats decision of the Odisha High Court. Now, before that, let me lay down the context. The problem here arises, or the problem that Safari Retreats case dealt with, is ITC. There is a restriction vis-a-vis goods or services received by a taxable person for construction of an immovable property other than plant and machinery on his own account. This was the question before Odisha High Court in Safari Retreats case. Safari Retreats case upheld the right of ITC availment by a mall owner vis-a-vis input construction services. They basically held that on his own account in 17.5D excludes a scenario where that very property is being let out to others on payment of GST. Now, this is a very, very important legal interpretation. I am aware that there has been a lot of criticism against Safari.
For a second, yeah. If I may just interrupt. Sir, I think we will turn off the camera because there's some, once you started, there is some network issues. The audio is, there's some disturbance in the audio. I think there is some bandwidth error. So can we just...
Right. So I will, yeah, yes, I'll switch off the video.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Should I repeat this slide? Should I repeat this slide?
No, it's fine, sir. You can continue. But
okay.
the clarity is better, sir, when you turn off the video, I think.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Fair enough.
Sorry to interrupt, sir.
No problem. So, as I was saying, that Safari Retreats case has faced a lot of flack because it is not very well reasoned. It's not well articulated. The arguments of the other side, of the government side, has not been dealt with properly. So it may not sustain ultimately before the Supreme Court. But I think it has opened a door to a very nice, a very radical legal interpretation. And to my mind, it's the right path to go. Because if you look at the interpretation of on his own account in this case, it is in line with what in income tax, in the context of deciding what is planned and not, there used to be a test of settings versus means. So the test is the immovable property in question. The property in question, is it merely a settings? Is it merely an establishment where people are coming and working? Or is it the means of providing an output taxable activity? I think that is a very, very critical test that ought to be applied in the context of Section 17, because unlike VAT, unlike SENVAT credit, ITC under GST, to my mind, is at a higher pedestal. Seamless availability of credit is something that has been referred to even in the constitutional amendment bill for GST. So to that extent, ITC is at a higher pedestal. So if we have to read restrictions under 17.5, I think that reading has to be tempered with the keeping in mind the objectives of GST. And it is in that context that I want to highlight Safari Retreats case, despite the misgivings that many of us have about this judgment in particular. So what Safari Retreats has enabled us, and already people have acted upon it, 3 such writs have already been filed by people who were bringing up hotels or other such real estate construction was happening, which would have been let out by charging GST to other people. So wherever it is the real estate that is being constructed, which is the means for providing output taxable services, I think Safari Retreats, or the arguments used in Safari Retreat, can be relied upon to obtain credit. This will of course be a proactive litigation solution, because no one is going to give you this credit for asking. And this is not only going to benefit hotels or malls, this will also benefit people who are in the business of private ports or private airports under the public-private partnership model. Anyone who is bidding to be a concessionaire for a port or an airport under a PPP model can also reliably place faith in this particular line of argument. And in fact, the amount at stake, the amount of credit at stake for a port or airport project will be much higher than a mall or hotel. I was working on a port project where I think just for the breakwater, which is like a wall in the sea to ensure calm waters for the functioning of the port, just on the breakwater, there was about a 700 crore credit that was getting lost because of 17.5. So I think that's the kind of numbers we are talking about for port and airport projects, and that is the importance of this proactive solution, so to say. So Safari Retreats, for all its flaws, I think has opened a door for a planning option or a litigation-based planning option that we ought to consider for our clients. Let's move on to the next point, Aditya. Transaction in securities. Now, this also is a proactive option, so to say. Now, all of us are aware of Section 17.3, which specifies that value of exempt supply has to include transaction in securities. What is transaction in securities? GST law borrows the definition from Securities Contract Regulation Act of 1956, which defines securities to include shares, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, derivatives. So if you look at the definition, it's a very wide definition, fairly detailed definition. It would cover most treasury operations of companies, which will include investments in mutual funds, hedging against currency or commodity prices. So a lot of times, I mean, especially for large companies, the treasury operations lead to a fair bit of credit reversal, a significant amount of credit reversal on an annual basis on the ground of, under the head of transaction in securities. So it is probably imperative that one analyzes the validity of 17.3. If you look at the whole structure of 17.1, 2, and 3, 17.3 is merely prescribing a value of exempt supply. What is exempt supply? If you look at the definition, securities cannot fall under that because securities are excluded from the definition of goods as well as services. If you look at the definition of exempt supply as well as non-taxable supply, both of them start with goods or services. If something is neither goods nor services, it can never be an exempt supply, it can never be a non-taxable supply. If something definitionally cannot be an exempt supply, how can a provision, which is not even a deeming fiction, mind you, 17.3, I have used the word deeming fiction loosely. If you read 17.3, it does not say deeming fiction. The legislative power of deeming has not been used under 17.3. It just states that value of exempt supply shall include transaction in securities, and the value will be as prescribed in the annexure. Even if you look at Rule 42, which in the CGST rules, that also talks about reversal on account of exempt supplies and taxable supplies. But for any securities, for any transaction involving securities, it will not be a supply in the first place, and neither will it be an exempt supply. So to that extent, 17.3, to the as far as it restricts credit or mandates reversal of credit vis-a-vis transaction in securities, is vulnerable to a challenge, has very weak legs to stand on, legally speaking, because 17.3 is merely to assign value to exempt supply, cannot supersede a definition of exempt supply at all. And this can be challenged in a writ as being contrary to the scheme of the CGST Act, as being ambiguous, as for attempting to levy GST indirectly on securities. Because if you look at entry 90, if I remember correctly, of the union list, transactions of stock exchanges and securities transactions, tax on that is covered under entry 90, which remains unamended even after GST. So the space, the legislative space for taxation of GST, to my mind, is still under entry 90 and cannot be usurped under GST, cannot be usurped under Article 246A. GST does not do that directly, but by making mandating credit reversal vis-a-vis securities, it is trying to probably do that indirectly, and to that extent would be vulnerable to a challenge. And of course, there is unreasonableness also, because there is no rational basis for prescribing 1% of the sale value of security as a value of exempt supplies. So all of these grounds taken together for companies where there is significant amount of treasury activity, I think this can be a good option to explore. Let's move to the next point. Who can benefit from the recent Bharti Airtel decision of the Delhi High Court? Now, This is a decision that came, I think, earlier this month or some late last month. So because of the numbers involved, 923 crores of benefit was basically made available to Bharti Airtel post this decision. A lot of client calls were received by me asking how can we rely on this. So let's examine the Bharti Airtel decision. What are the facts? July to September 2017, Bharti was unable to correctly ascertain ITC that was available to it, because if you remember, that was a time of chaos. Facility of 2A, 1A, GSTR2, nothing was available. There was no clarity as to which returns are to be filed. 3B was on its way. So Bharti availed credit only on an estimated basis. And in October 2018, it went on to ascertain that 923 crores of excess GST payment has been made in cash, because they could not ascertain the amount of credit that was available in the July to September period. So Bharti's grievance was, it was not being allowed to rectify for the tax period of July to September 2017. If it was allowed to, then it will utilize ITC to pay off GST liability to the tune of 923 crores and seek refund of that 923 crores that was paid in excess. They were stopped by a circular of 29 December, which said that rectification could only happen in the month in which the error was discovered. So Delhi High Court allowed Airtel to rectify its return for the tax period to which the error pertained, held that Airtel cannot be deprived of its statutory right and benefits, and read down that circular to the extent it restricted such rectification. High Court also ordered the revenue authorities to, within a period of 2 weeks, verify the claim made by Airtel and give effect to the same. So effectively, Airtel would end up getting a refund of a huge amount, 923 crores. The first key takeaway from this is, of course, that it is very, very fact specific. It is restricted to the July to September period when there was a complete chaos. So if anyone is trying to take a benefit of this particular judgment, we have to establish the facts are exactly same as Bharti Airtel's. It was impossible to ascertain the exact amount of credit, and because of which there was, there may be a cause of action. Because if we apply this judgment without any limit, it can lead to a Pandora's box, because if you allow SSEs to rectify GSTR 3B every time a mistake is unearthed, and that too going back in time, that's going to be unsustainable from a system stability perspective. But the good part about this judgment is there has been a clear judicial recognition of the failure to implement the statutory mechanism for filing GSTR 123 returns. If you remember, GSTR 123 returns were designed in such a way that they were like a self-policing mechanism. Recipient and supplier could verify, validate, modify, delete, thereby ensuring that there was no hanky-panky. There was a free flow of credit. There was a free flow of information. All of that mechanism never came into place, was never implemented. So government having failed to implement that, Delhi High Court held, it cannot be allowed to take benefits of its own wrong. And this is an important standalone observation that will be applicable even for some of the other disputes that we discussed, for the 2A versus 3B disputes, when the whole mechanism was envisaged by GST law, but the government itself failed, the IT system failed. SSEs cannot be saddled with that particular responsibility and be punished for failures at the supplier's end. A recipient cannot be punished for a failure at the supplier's end. Let's move on to the next slide. So who can benefit? As I said, SSEs who can establish factually that in the July to September, in that period, or maybe another month or so, there was a complete chaos. There was impossibility of ascertaining the exact amount of ITC, and to that extent, there is a claim to be made. Those people can definitely try their luck by relying upon this particular judgment. But we need to keep in mind time limits. Let's first look at what is the time limit for rectification basis this order. Obviously, this is not a scenario covered under the CGST Act. If we apply Limitation Act, 3 years from when the right to apply accrues. So if we say that the right accrues from the Delhi High Court judgment, it would give us a massive time window, 3 years from 5th May 2020 when this judgment came in. But that, let's not get too happy about it. because what is the use of rectification if we can't seek refund? The whole idea of seeking the rectification is to obtain refund post allowance of rectification. Relevant date for refund is 2 years from the time limit. There is a 2 years time limit. Now, where does it start from? There is a provision under in the relevant date definition which talks about if a judgment, if a refund is arising out of a consequence of a judgment. However, this refund will not be a direct consequence of a judgment. This is the one step removed. First, there is rectification, which is a direct consequence of the judgment, followed by refund, which is a consequence of rectification. So to my mind, this may not fall under that particular entry of relevant date, which talks about consequence of judgment. In that case, it would be the date of excess payment of tax and not the date of the Delhi High Court judgment. So if we start from excess payment of tax, 2 years, I think the window is fairly limited to claim this particular benefit. But one can still try their luck if the facts are aligned, if the facts are similar to Bharti Airtel decision. Of course, one unforeseen implication that would arise is if there is a reduction in output supply in GSTR 3B, will that necessitate suppliers GSTR 1 revision, and consequently GSTR 2A may also need to be changed. So that is a consequence that has not been dealt with in the case of by Delhi High Court. But we need to be, as advisors, as mindful of that particular implication. And this leaves us with the last point before we open the Q&A. Aditya, let's go to the next slide. Alternative strategy for anti-profiteering investigations. Now, I don't think there is anyone who does not know that there are strong constitutional arguments against the whole anti-profiteering mechanism under Section 171 and even the Constitution of Napa. From Madras itself, the case emerged which struck down the validity of GST Appellate Tribunal. The arguments taken there are squarely applicable vis-a-vis Napa. Napa is nothing but a tribunal. It has all trappings of a court, and to that extent, not having a single judicial member in Napa, I think, makes it very vulnerable to a writ challenge. But the question arises in a more strategic way. We have all seen that Napa has been adopting a very conservative approach. A lot of adverse orders have come, especially in the real estate space, especially in the consumer goods space. And I think it's become reasonably easy and possible to predict that where in a real estate context, ITCs to turnover percentage is higher under GST compared to pre-GST, or price was not reduced at the time of rate reduction, any GST rate reduction. In both these cases, whatever argument you give, I think there's a 90-95% chance that Napa will hold against your client. That's what the track record says, at least. So that brings us to the point that at what point do I raise these constitutional arguments? We can, of course, wait till the Napa's order and, like everyone else, go to High Court after the Napa order, challenging the Napa order along with the constitutional questions. But by that time, I think our clients have already faced a reputational risk. Our clients have already faced the adverse consequences of a judgment from Napa. I think, especially in scenarios like I mentioned, where ITCs to turnover percentage is higher, or when price has not been reduced, it may be a better idea to raise this challenge, to raise the constitutional arguments even before Napa takes cognizance of our case. When the investigation is underway, at that stage itself, it is better to raise this argument and repel a process which is unconstitutional, and avoid going before a tribunal whose very constitution, whose very functioning is devoid of constitutional validity. Instead of appearing before Napa, it is better to challenge it at a much earlier stage. Because why do I say that? Practically speaking, if you see the series of orders that have emerged from high courts, wherever people have gone after a Napa order, about 40 to 50% of the anti-profiteered amount as outlined in the Napa order has been asked to be deposited as a condition of stay. So among crores of rupees have been deposited by various companies because they have gone after a Napa order. And to that extent, this particular strategy of challenging this, because these are all very solid, very strong constitutional arguments, there is no doubt on the strength of this constitutional argument. Madras High Court itself has upheld these arguments in the context of GST Appellate Tribunal. So why shy away from raising this at the outset? Why be part of a process, an unconstitutional process, especially when we are reasonably certain of the outcome from the trend, because there are already close to 100 NAPA orders. So I think there is a suitable sample size to ascertain a trend. So in these cases, I think it is imperative that we consider filing the writ, raising this constitutional argument at a much earlier stage, as opposed to waiting for the NAPA order to come and then going to a High Court against that NAPA order. So I think these are the 8 points that I wanted to highlight, which I felt or which I foresee will have a lot of play in the next 8 to 12 months. Happy to hear questions.
Thank you very much, Sudipto sir, for this wonderful presentation. We can take up the question answer now. I'll stop the screen sharing. So you can turn on your camera now.
Okay, I have done that already.
Yes, sir. So there are a couple of
am I visible?
Probably it will just take a couple of seconds. Not yet.
Sure.
So, yes, sir. Now. So there are a couple of questions already in the chat box. So I'll just put those questions in front of you so that you can answer. So first is, on the basis of Safari Retreat, can we avail the ITC on the long-term lease of a land, say 99 years, where RCM is applicable?
See, on the basis of Safari Retreats, I don't think we can take any credit. We will have to file and get the file a writ and fight for that particular, challenge a particular provision before we avail it of. Because Safari Retreats is a Odisha High Court judgment which is already pending before Supreme Court. I don't think it has been stayed yet. But given the quality of that judgment, it is likely to get overturned. So we have to first implement the solution by filing a writ. That's why I said it's a proactive mitigation solution before we take any position in this Safari Retreat.
Okay, sir. Sir, I think there is some network issue at your end, so we'll have to close the camera, so then only the audio is more clear. Yes, sir. I think now it is fine.
Done.
So next question.
You can share the chat box.
Yes, sir. I'll enable the chat box, but I've already got the question. I'll just read out one more question and then we can.
Sure.
What is the scope of on his own account vis-a-vis ITC on goods and services used for construction of immovable property?
So very simply put, if I am constructing a house or an office, I am getting a contractor, I am buying cement, etc. All of those goods and services I am procuring for my own construction. That, to my mind, that is what is covered under on his own account and the credit restriction there. If, to sort of elaborate on the Safari Retreats argument, if I am using that for creating an asset which is the means of my business, whether it's a mall, whether it's a hotel, whether it's a port or an airport, there on my own account should not apply. On my own account has to be read not only in the context of 17.5, but in the context of overall GST law as such, which elevates our right of credit to a much higher pedestal than it was under SEMRAT credit rules, than it was under VAT. If we look at section 16, it starts with a blank. The thumb rule is credit is available except for the specified circumstances. And then we come to 17.5 for the various specified circumstances. So 17.5 is in the nature of an exception. So we have to read exceptions as opposed to, I mean, in a manner, in a restricted manner, which does not dilute the main rule per se. So that's how I would read on his own account.
Yes, sir. To any other participants, so if you have any questions, you can put in your queries in the chat box, or you can raise your hands. I'll unmute you and then you can ask the question yourself. Mr. Vikas, I think I read out his question only, but he wants to add on something. I'll unmute
Sure.
him.
Hello.
Yes, Mr. Vikas.
Yeah, Vikas.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay. Hi, Sudipto. My question is in respect of order of AAR in the case of Nalco. So what happened in that case? Nalco was maintaining a township of employees. Okay, and it was also responsible for doing incurring expenditure for repair and maintenance of the residential accommodation, and it wanted to claim the input tax credit of the expenses incurred for repair and maintenance. But what the authority held, see, you are providing this residential accommodation as a perquisite to the employees, okay? And since the perquisites are not taxable, okay, therefore it will amount to exempted supply to employees, and any services used by the employer for providing exempted supply would, be barred by 17(2). Now, my question is this, that, the reason why perquisite is not taxable, it is because of Schedule 3. Okay, Schedule 3 says that, any services by the employee to employee will not be taxable. Okay, if that be so, in the course of your session, you very nicely explained the scope of the term exempted supply. Okay, exempted supply also includes non-taxable supply. Okay, but I don't think that Schedule 3 can be treated to be a non-taxable supply, because Schedule 3 is a transaction which is neither treated to be supply of goods nor supply of services. Okay, therefore, it will not be non-taxable supply because it is outside even the scope of non-taxable supply. So what the point which I'm trying to make is this: exempted supply is the supply, it includes non-taxable supply, okay, and non-taxable supplies are basically in the nature of supply. But Schedule 3 are transactions which are not in the nature of supply. Therefore, I don't think that the perquisites being provided by the employer to employee will fall under the scope of non-taxable supply. If that
So, because I will react to it, I'll react
so,
to it
they
in
will
a
also
different
not
way.
form, part of exempted.
Yes, sir. Sudipto, sir, you can.
Right, right. Yeah. So, Vikas, if I have understood the query, and for any of
And
the
therefore,
participants who
17(2) will not be applicable. I want your views on this. Pardon?
sorry,
Hello? Yeah.
So, Vikas, if I have understood your query, because it broke a little in the middle, so you are saying that since the NALCO advance ruling was based on, gave an adverse order, denied ITC vis-a-vis the expenses for residential quarters of employees, on the basis that these are expenses incurred by the company for a exempt supply to its employee. Is that a correct conclusion? I think that's what you're asking, right?
That's right. That's what I'm asking, right?
Okay. So, I think I'll approach the NALCO decision in a slightly different way. I think they should not have gone on to the point of whether it is perquisite, whether it is exempt supply. I think the question to be asked is this in the course of business or not? I think
Absolutely.
that is the simple test to be applied. I was quite surprised. I remember reading the judgment that why have they tied themselves up in knots by going into the whole point of is it exempt supply, is it not? Because that is not the question at all. I think the question is simply, is it a business, is it a in the course of business or not? And when we see places like places where Alco has its plant, if it's a remote area, it is the duty of the plant owner to ensure there is residential accommodation nearby for employees and workers, so that they are not inconvenienced. To that extent, I think in many cases, it is very much in the course of business. So to that extent, credit ought to be allowed. I mean, in a scenario where we are talking about, say, a Delhi, Bombay metro kind of a setup, they're probably providing residential accommodation to employees. One can say is not in the course of business. It is a perquisite. It's a supply being given to an employee. But in a city which is built around a plant, which is often the case with the likes of Nalco, I think it is in the course of business and credit should have been allowed.
Okay, so Dito, one more question arising out of this only, and I fully agree with you that they should be treated to be in the course or furtherance of business. But now, having established that it is in the course of furtherance of business, can the department also take a view that, okay, you are coming into 16.1, but then your ITC is blocked under 17.5G because these services of repair and maintenance is used by the employees for personal consumption?
Which is what I said that we have to see personal consumption in the context of where the location of the residential accommodation. If it is purely in a remote area where there is no other option for residents, then I don't think that argument works. If we are like we have facilities in Korba where it's jungle all around, and there you have to provide facilities for your employees and workers to stay. So in those exceptional scenarios, I think credit should be available. In all other scenarios, as I said, if Nalco or any other company is providing residential accommodation in the form of quarters, etc., in a metro city of whichever tier, I think credit should not be available there. It will get blocked either part of business, or even if it crosses the business threshold, it will get stuck under personal consumption requirement. I think it's only in a remote location where probably credit should be eligible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
So one question from Mr. Gokarnation, sir. I'll just unmute him.
Yeah.
Gokarnation, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sir, good evening, sir. Very good presentation. I just have one query.
Thank you, sir.
I just have one query. Suppose if the Supreme Court approves the Odisha High Court order on taking the credit of construction activity on immovable property, which in turn leased out for rent on the GST is payable. Now the question is, suppose if Supreme Court agrees this and issue order later, I want to take the credit subsequent to the Supreme Court order, but the time limit is lapsed. Suppose from my invoice date till I take the credit, the time limit of September, before September, or the annual return 9 is filed, whichever is earlier, that time is lapsed. So I could not take the credit subsequently because of the limitation. Now my question is, can I take the credit now with a letter to the department quoting the Odisha High Court order decision and keep the amount unutilized till the outcome of the decision of the Supreme Court, and to avoid the interest and other penal action? Is it okay, sir?
We can do that. Yes, we can do that. We can also, what some other players I mentioned, and I think this is a point I ought to have covered. It was there in my slide also. The 3 High Court, I mentioned that this has been filed in 3 High Courts already, right? Punjab and Haryana High Court has given a specific interim order to this effect that subject to the outcome of our order, the time limit will not apply. So the 36(4) time limit has been held inapplicable. So if Punjab Haryana High Court decides that credit is available at the end after they have heard the writ, they will hold the time limit to be inapplicable. So to that extent, an interim order has been obtained. So both the options are available. So one can, your client can go and file a writ and seek that interim order like Punjab and Haryana and wait for a final this thing. Or you can take the credit. See, the only problem is, if we take and not utilize, while there are a lot of arguments to say that under Section 50, interest should not be eligible, etc., department may not accept those arguments. So I'm saying there can be some litigation exposure there, even though I believe we will win that litigation. So whether or not our client has appetite for that litigation, also we need to take that call. Cleaner option is to file a writ quote the Punjab Haryana interim order and get a similar interim order from our jurisdictional high court, and sort of fight that battle as it comes. Probably that's a cleaner option.
Suppose if I file a writ today, already time is over. For example, already time is lapsed. So whether the writ will be accepted by the High Court. Suppose if I approach the High Court within the limitation period, is it okay? Or even I can approach after the limitation is over?
So we can see the question of the argument of latches, delays and latches can always be raised by a revenue against a writ. So if it is a real estate property that has been in existence from 2017 and we are only coming in 2020, I think delays and latches will apply against us. The writs that have been filed are either for properties that are under construction or just about to commence construction in the next few months. So there some of these writs will come in handy. So if we are going after the time period prescribed and the statute has expired, I don't think a reasonable High Court will entertain. I mean, the delays and latches ground will apply against us. So when we are at a planning stage, or at least at the initial phases of construction, I think this is a good option to adopt.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. So with your permission, we'll just take up 2 more questions, sir, and then
sure.
Yes, sir. So there is one question from Mr. Ramesh. Mr. Ramesh. I'll just read it out, sir, because he's having some issue with this. So
Sure.
His question is whether supply of service rendered by an Indian subsidiary to an overseas parent entity qualify as export of service. Will it get covered under transaction between distinct person and categorized under intra-supply?
But if it's a subsidiary for a subsidiary is a legal entity, foreign company is also a legal entity. So why would it be distinct person? It can be export. I mean, so depends on the nature of the services. If it's not intermediary, if it is is not doing commission agent kind of work, then it can qualify as export. If it's doing only support services, it can qualify as export. Otherwise, it may qualify as intermediary and be taxable in India. So, I mean, we'll need to see the nature of the services. But I think at a fundamental level, this is not a distinct entity scenario. No, this is a case where 2 separate legal entities exist.
Okay, sir. I hope Mr. Ramesh would have got his answer. Thank you, sir. Sir, I'll just unmute Mr. Debayan Das, and with that, after that, we'll conclude the session. Sir.
Sure.
Hello. I just heard that proposal of taking credit in the return and not utilizing. I just wanted to highlight that in the GSTR 3B, if you take the credit, you cannot park it. It will automatically get utilized. So there is no parking option in the GSTR 3B. That is one practical aspect I thought to highlight, that even if somebody is tying, he may not be able to do so. As far as the GSTR 3B is concerned, that is the only way you can take credit. And second thing, I heard some queries on NALCO, where remote location residential complexes and park related expenses they have disallowed. But I just like to highlight there is a Telangana High Court judgment in the case of ITC Limited where such credits were allowed in the service tax regime. And the ground was exactly the same thing, that our factory in Bhadrachalam is remotely located where you do not have anything, any place to stay or any infrastructure to provide to the employees other than your own infrastructure. So that Telangana High Court judgment can be one handy argument to counter the NALCO's AR.
Right. So, thank you, Devan, for pointing that out. In fact, ITC and there are 2-3 other SESTAT decisions also in the SENVAT credit regime where similar arguments were taken, and which was the basis on which I said that remote location is an argument that will sustain. But other than that, residential credit vis-a-vis residential premises would not be available. Coming to your first point, GSTR 3B point well taken. Typically, what people do is they take the credit and reverse it and say that this is how we have not utilized it. So probably that's a way out. to avoid utilization.
But Sudipto, only one point. In the GST law, there is no provision for re-availment of credit other than Rule 37 for 180 days making not payment. There is no provision for re-availment of credit. Once it is reversed, you can argue that it was wrongly reversed or it should not have been reversed. But at least from the law, other than the case of payment to vendors more than 180 days, we didn't find any provision for re-availment of credit. So if you reversed it, then the same question may be raised by the department in future also, that how can you now take the credit because law doesn't allow re-availment.
So, point taken. So there are a few things that are not specifically mentioned in the law, but are neither prohibited in the law. So that's what we are trying to draw support from in even unrelated context. But the mechanism of depositing duty under protest. Protest is also not a mechanism provided under GST law, but we are doing it, right? We are drawing basis first principles. We are continuing with the practice. So I believe that we don't need a specific provision for re-availing. Once in the context that we are discussing, of course, department may object to it. I can't rule that out. But otherwise, as you rightly highlighted, there may not be any option to park credit, to take and to park it. There is no other. Maybe we reverse and we file a letter saying we are reversing under protest, and thereby retain a right to re-avail it. So those things can be considered. None of those are obviously envisaged under GST law, but this is first principles of law. I think we can take those up.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. So before we conclude the session, I would like to call upon Mr. A.P. Srinivas to kindly concluding remark, and after that we can share we can close the session, sir. APS, sir, over to you.
Hi. Now his video can be sorry about sir, Mr. Sudipta, you can switch on your video, sir.
He's switched it on, sir.
Sir, Mr.
Sudipto, sir, you can turn on your video. Sir,
I have.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
So it was a very enlightening session today. You have divided your topic into 8 divisions. That itself is a novel way. Here there is one song in the film called Basha, where our Tamil actor superstar Rajinikanth divided life into 8 divisions. So like that, you have divided your lecture into 8 parts today. That itself is a novel idea today. So out of that 4 topics I want to quote here, sir, in my summing up. The first thing is the brand equity judgment by the Delhi High Court. So I am defending the government here, one of the senior standing counsel for GST and customs. So I thought once fitting the general limitation to GST Act will be a problem. So most probably the court could have gone into the issue whether it is mandatory or directive only. And at that time they could have given some leverage to the revenue to look into the bona fide of the assessee. So by fitting into the general limitation to GST Act, suppose if that analogy is also fitting to other sections, then it would be a problem only. You rightly touched upon that. And the further thing is another judgment of the Delhi High Court by saying that department has to announce in their website. So probably those 2 reasons might have tilted the judgment in favor of the revenue today in getting the entry modus, I feel, sir. Then the next thing is on the Bharti Airtel judgment. You rightly analyzed both on the point of the assessee and as well as on the point of the revenue also. The revenue also cannot say that without sufficient mechanism, they cannot also take benefit of their own wrong, as said by you. And also the assessee also cannot come after a long point of time saying that only release the mistake. So there will be some end point of time to rectify any kind of mistake. And when it is at the hands of the assessee, he should be very careful. When it is not on the part of the department, so within the time he has to rectify his error. I think up to every September he is allowed to rectify their mistakes. Then the another thing is on the apportionment of credit and blocked credits under section 17. The Orissa High Court has given with respect to 17(5)(d) in respect of works contract. I think in all the provisions of section 17, we can face new litigations. It may, especially in hotel industry also, when the rate of tax is fixed by a notification by saying that you have to sell your goods at the particular GST without availing ITC. And on the other hand, in 17(5)(d), it says if the service is utilized in furtherance of the same business, then you can take rent. I think there we can expect some kind of disputes. And in the end, the last one you touched in the 8th chapter. So I think you have covered the entire GST and you have given a new lot of scope for new petitions to come, sir. So the entire Madras Tax Bar is benefited, and on behalf of the Madras Tax Bar, I wholeheartedly thank you and my friend Mr. Aditya Reddy, who is the instrumental for bringing you today here, sir. I thank once again, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
APS, for summing up the entire session. And thank you very much, Sudipto sir, for accepting our invitation and in a very short span of time and taking this wonderful session. And I thank all the participants who have joined us today from across the country and from various bar associations. So thank you very much once again for joining us. The session will be uploaded in our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel called Madras Tax Bar Chennai. I have shared the link already in the chat box. You can catch up with all our webinars which we have conducted till date. Thank you, Sudipto sir.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll end the session now. Thank you very much.